This podcast is brought to you by sarahraven.com, which is home to everything you need for a truly beautiful and productive garden. You'll also find great and essential gardening kit and stylish, lovely things to have in your house to bring the outside indoors, all inspired by the garden and the house being tied together. There's also plenty of garden inspiration, how-to videos and specialist growing guides. So head over to sarahraven.com today to discover even more. Welcome to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven, and different guests. But actually today I'm on my own, and I wanted to do a solo today because I've just walked around the garden and I've suddenly realised that there's a real NB to all of us, including me, which is to harvest your allium seed heads from now on for Christmas. So I don't know about you, but I am a bit obsessed, and I'm sorry if I've bored on about it before, but I really think Christmas this year has got to be as natural as it possibly can be and as sustainable, but it's also, in my household, I want it to be glamorous and twinkly and amazing and unique and unusual. And do you know what? The short circuit straight into that is allium seed heads. And in previous years, I have sprayed them with silver spray, but I think that's not sufficiently sustainable these days. And so, in fact, I'm going to make a really concentrated food colouring sort of atomizer with 3 or 4 different colours, red, a sort of silvery grey, and I think perhaps an acid green, I'm not absolutely sure. And I'm going to dry my allium heads from now on, and then I'm going to colour them once they're dry. And it's better to do it that way round rather than to do them when they've still got some moisture in, because they will then shrink and some of the spray will then crack off. So that's my experience anyway. But really oddly, this is the first NB to prepare for Christmas, and particularly a natural Christmas. And Arthur and I are going to be doing a whole series of courses at Perch Hill here in November and December on how to make your Christmas really beautiful, but almost entirely garden sourced. So alliums are the way. Anyway, it made me think about alliums at a time when they are flowering away and looking their most beautiful. So I actually thought I would do a recap of my favourites and explain why I particularly love different ones. I just walked round, we've got 22 different varieties growing in the garden right now, and most of them are in flower actually. So they flower from May into June and into July, and then the last of all that we grow here to flower is allium sphaerocephalum, which means round head, which is the little one that looks like a sort of big drum stick head. So quite tall and with a little sort of round sphere on the end, which is why it's called sphaerocephalum. Anyway, that's starting at the end. So let's start at the beginning. And the first one to flower here pretty much every year, and this year actually, because we've had quite a mild, wet winter and spring, they started flowering in early May. Sometimes it can be 2 or 3 weeks later, but it's allium purple sensation. And that is the really good value, incredibly perennial variety. I put 50 bulbs into the Oast garden when I first made that garden 26, 27 years ago, and they're still there. And actually we thin them a bit every sort of 3rd year. And purple sensation is the deep, almost like amethyst purple. But when it seeds, it actually goes a more mauve. And initially when that happened, I wasn't so sure, and I was sort of taking them out, and now I'm much more easy about it. And so there's this rather nice colour gradation between a really saturated boiled sweet purple to a slightly more sort of a bit of white in it, going to mauve. Anyway, I adore those because they're so early, but also they have beautiful seed heads that look like a whole sphere of little green beads, and they're quite small. They will fit in the palm of my hand, and I'll come back to that because it's really good to have different sizes of alliums for your Christmas decorations. Anyway, by sort of early to mid-May, the foliage is already beginning to die back. And that's one of the things that you'll find with alliums, is that they emerge really early. If you go and look in your herb bed in February, you'll find chives are already beginning to poke up way before most herbaceous perennial herbs. And it's true of all the allium family. They come up really early, so they can photosynthesize away from the middle of February, middle of March, middle of April, and then they flower in the middle of May. So they've had 3 good months plus of photosynthesizing, storing food back into the bulb. So by the time they erupt and come into flower, you can actually remove the leaves. And that's nice, because the one thing about alliums, well, perhaps there are 2, but one of the downsides is that their foliage is quite messy. And so we remove it, and you never want to wear white or pale colours when you're removing allium foliage, because the orange pigment, which you get if you're a natural dye person, you can get from onion skins, it gives you a rather nice sort of yellowy, saffrony, orangey colour, but it will stain your clothes forever. So just be aware of that. Wear dark clothes or overalls or whatever when you're removing the foliage of your alliums. Anyway, the second downside that I just wanted to mention is some of them do self-seed almost too prolifically. And that's one of the reasons that Josie, our head gardener here, is a bit not so sure about them. But the reason I am crazy about alliums is that they bridge the gap between when the tulips go over and when the roses and the sweet peas really get going in sort of June and into July. So they are the perfect colour baton-carrier. And in succession planting and designing, I always think that my dominant plants are in a relay race, and one family of plants has the baton in the relay race running around the track, and it has to pass that baton on to the next family of plants to carry the colour baton on to the next family of plants. And with us here, we use the little baby iris for February. We then move on to a huge range of narcissus for March, and then, of course, tulips for April into May, and then on to alliums, and they then hand the colour baton on to roses and sweet peas and hardy annuals. So they're really key to our succession here. So purple sensation is definitely my number one. Good value, really perennial. The bees absolutely love it. And they do all alliums. Chives famously are always busy with bees, but every single one that I'm going to mention, if you go and put a chair next to a little clump of the flowers and just watch it for 5 minutes and count how many bee visits you get, and then move your chair to another plant also in flower, unless it's foxglove, which are very good bee plants, you'll find that alliums win hands down. They are unbelievably nectar and pollen rich. And so the bees and pollinators absolutely love them. So number one, purple sensation, Halandicum going along with it. Number 2, which flowers about a week to 10 days after purple sensation, is purple rain. Now, purple rain is actually, I think, a cross between Christophii, which I'll come to, which is a big football-sized one, and purple sensation. And so it flowers a tiny bit later, but it's a little bit bigger in the sphere than purple sensation, and a little bit airier, and a little bit perhaps more dramatic. So whereas with purple sensation, you probably want to plant 15 or 20 bulbs to get impact, with purple rain, you could halve that and you would still get a really beautiful show, because it's just that much more sort of magnificent and spectacular. And I love it, but it is a little bit more expensive, so it's worth thinking about that. And then, not surprisingly, as the other parent, Christophii comes into flower next. So towards the end of May, Christophii emerges into flower, and it goes on and expands more and more and more. So when it first opens, it's sort of like 2 cupped hands in diameter, but by the time it's beginning to go over and form seed heads, it's literally at least double that size. So it's really, really spectacular, magnificent, and very good value. So it's open field pollinated, which makes it really, really good value. And I love it. And it's a fantastic one for seed heads. So we use Christophii perhaps more than any other because it's good value, in the garden as a bulb, but then also as a seed head, that makes it good value. So purple sensation and Christophii are the 2 that I use really a lot at Christmas. Then I have to mention another crazy series of them, which is even bigger than Christophii, and it looks like a sort of stellar galaxy. It looks like shooting stars from one central sort of purple sensation size kind of hub in the middle. And then it has these great wands erupting out, literally like shooting stars. And some of those wands can be 20, 25 centimeters from the middle. So it really is a magnificent thing. Shorter stems. And I think it must have evolved to be shorter because otherwise I think it would just get blown away. So it's sort of not ground hugging, but it definitely is a bit shorter. And it's unbelievably wonderful at the top of a Christmas tree. And so you don't need very many because it is quite expensive, but both in the garden and at Christmas, wow. I mean, it is just quite something. And bred from it, there are 2 or 3 new varieties that are slightly smaller, but still amazing and kind of, oh, you know, they really are like a sort of globe that you had in the sort of geography lesson at school size. And one is called Spider, which is deeper purple than Schubertii. And the other is Arctic Snow, which is brand new, actually, which is a sort of greeny white. And all those have been bred from Schubertii. And they just have slightly deeper colouring, Spider, and much, much paler colouring, Arctic Snow. So that's an exciting one because it's just come onto the market. And we had it in the garden here last year. And actually I saw it in Chelsea in May. And quite a few stands had it. And it was looking really magnificent, I have to say. So another little side shimmy now to something that used to be called Nectarscordum bulgaricum. Bit of a mouthful. Now called Allium bulgaricum or Allium sicilium. And they're all the same plant. And this is like a candelabra. So it has a tall stem. And then from the top, rather than radiating out in a globe, it actually has a hanging candelabra series of flowers with these beautiful bells on the end. Again, forms lovely, lovely seed heads. Not so much for the Christmas tree, but I love them just drying in a vase, and they dry brilliantly. And sometimes I might colour them, or sometimes I'll let them just gently brown as the pigment gets withdrawn. Very elegant. And do you know what? Unlike the other alliums, very happy in shade. So I was brought up with that one, actually. My parents had it in a shade border where I was brought up just outside Cambridge. And it's still there. My mother still gardens there. And it is quite persistent. So a tiny bit of a word of warning with that. If you love an immaculate garden and you don't like self-seeders, I think Nectarscordum bulgaricum is probably not one for you. But if you're a bee, it's the number one top favourite. Get your chair, sit beside it, and it's like watching a bee ballet. I promise you, you just cannot believe the different species of bumblebees that visit it and the volume and number of bees at any one time as soon as the sun comes out. So it's a real winner, I think. But yeah, it just can be a little bit invasive. So into June, we've already mentioned Christophii, which is there and enlarging. And then there are a couple of other new ones that we've had here over the last couple of years, and we have them on the bank growing in amongst the dahlias, actually, on the bank there below the greenhouse. And there are two that are closely related, Allium nigrum, which that means black, but it's very odd because they're white, but I think it must be that the seeds are black. And then it's got a new hybrid, and that's called Pink Jewel. And these are neater. They're more like sort of pom-poms in a way. They're more dense, less kind of airy, but in a way more showy. And they have an incredible vase life. All alliums do, actually. I'm sitting in front of me. There's a huge vase of them right in front of me with 7 or 8 different varieties. But I've noticed that the nigrums really go on looking pretty splendid for a very long time. And then, of course, give you seed heads, but they're not as airy and graceful as the others. So they're more as a cut flower rather than as a dried seed head, I would say. But I love them, and they are really splendid. And related to them too, well, they're all related, but more closely in their looks, is Allium giganteum. And a friend of mine sent me a picture who lives in northeast London, of these alliums that were towering above her head. And that, of course, she's not very tall, but that is, I'm sure, Allium giganteum. And that, again, has these denser heads where it doesn't have the sort of airiness and skeletalness to them, but they form these really proper, dense mauve pom-poms. And they are tall and they are very perennial. Quite expensive to buy initially, but totally will be in your garden for decades. So into July then, I am really mad about some tall, crazy shaped ones. And the first is summer drummer. Now, summer drummer we have in the farmhouse garden here. And to be honest, when it first came up, I thought, oh, that just looks like a leek. And so I wasn't so sure. But now I absolutely have totally fallen for them because in June, as I sit here, they are already 7 foot, 8 foot tall, this sort of eruption of these silver greeny kind of vertical lines in the garden with these funny little pepper pot top knots on top. And those actually don't emerge into flower until July, and then again they hold on to their flowers and their colour right the way through until September. So people couldn't believe them here last year because they're such a late allium, but also they're so tall. They don't need staking. They're completely self-supporting, and they give you this really, really fantastic, almost like foxgloves right now, but even taller, this brilliant sort of minaret vertical line in the garden, which I think so good. And so that certainly joins one of my favourites. And I'm just going to finish with a couple of others that I adore for their unusual shape. So the next one is Magic. And Magic is a showy, almost like a Christophii crossed with a Schubertii, but a little bit smaller, but it has the sort of the really crazy sparkler-like sort of rays away from the central globe. But the thing I love about it is it has often a really nice curve to the stem. So it sort of goes straight up and then suddenly it turns almost like a right angle and then almost like a right angle again. And so you get these really sculptural, interesting shapes in the garden because it's quite tall. And so I love that. And there's another one that has a similar habit, which is called Forelock, which actually was in Anne-Marie Powell's garden at Chelsea. And I spotted it immediately because you get these sort of crazy whirly-gig, just almost like a sort of, like a Catherine wheel, but, just the trail of the Catherine wheel behind it, given in green by these alliums. And a final one, which again gives you that same interesting shape, is called Red Mohican, which, like Spherocephalon, has got quite dense crimson flowers. And it's called Red Mohican because it's got a sort of Mohican haircut, sort of sticky-uppy flowers from the globe. So all those are, I'm afraid I've lost count of how many I've mentioned, but they're very dear to my heart. And it's because they are wonderful colour baton-carriers all the way through. That slightly tricky May, June colour gap in a garden, if you like your floweriness and colour. And then they come into their own again through the autumn in vases dried and then are the absolute pinnacle of beauty where you hardly need a bought-in Christmas decoration. But the key thing, the reason I'm talking about them now is that one, lots of them are in flower, but also two, don't leave them in the garden as the seed head too long. So once they're beginning to brown a little bit and you can see the stem is beginning to age a little bit, pick them, hang them upside down, but don't do that in your garden shed or even your garage and leave them there until Christmas because I promise you they will rot. They will get some mold and they go black and then they just disintegrate. So I'm afraid they do need a bit more TLC than that. So bring them in, dry them somewhere quite dry, and then in a month's time or so, just wrap them up in tissue and put them in the attic. And then you can go to them at Christmas, get the dye colouring out, and I'll talk more about that nearer Christmas as a sort of MB. I'll go through the instructions of exactly how to do that. But yeah, nothing nicer for your Christmas tree. And I know we don't want to think about Christmas quite yet, but if you want to be sustainable and you want to be garden-based in your Christmas decorations, alliums are the number one plant to turn to, and you need to do that now. Thanks so much for listening to Grow Cook Eat Arrange. I hope you enjoyed me rabbiting on about alliums, which are a big passion of mine. Next week, we've got a really glamorous and exciting guest, and that's Kim Sear, who is married to Andy Murray, and we're doing it at Wimbledon time because, of course, he is our tennis champ, or anyway, won the Olympics for all of us. His wife is a passionate gardener, absolutely loves tulips, loves lots of the things I love, and so I really want to talk to her about why she gardens and what are her favourite plants. So join us then. You can find more information, photos and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.